Can go. Okay. Welcome, everybody, to our session on Other Countries Have Safety Nets, the U.S. Has Women. This is going to be an opportunity to really talk about how the pandemic and our response to it has been shaped by gender, some of the possible feminist responses. So before we get started with the content, I would like to invite everybody to introduce yourself in the chat, to share who you are, your name, maybe what your organization is, your pronouns, if you would like to. Something that describes you. So I am blank. And something that you like to do. So you can see, if you can see my slide, we couldn't quite tell if you would be able to or not. I am Kim Simmons, she, her. I am a connector, and I like to swim in the ocean. So add your introduction to the chat, and you'll also see under polls, a poll about how you're feeling today. So just take a second, introduce yourself in the chat, and answer the poll. We have Morgan and Sally, Claudette, Lisa. We'll just give folks one more second. If you see on the right, you can take the poll. How are you feeling today? And you can choose more than one answer. So right now we are a pretty happy group, energized by yesterday, maybe a little wired, feeling sunny with a spring in our step, but also maybe a little fried, exhausted, or burned out. These aren't mutually exclusive feelings. We can feel all these things at once. So we will continue to welcome folks in as people maybe come in after, getting done with the networking and getting coffee, all that. But we'll also get started. So this workshop is an invitation to learn a little bit more about some of the contemporary ideas around feminist theory and to envision together what a feminist recovery might start to look like for ourselves and for the organizations that we work with. So really, thinking about this in the context of Maine's nonprofit landscape. A lot of our nonprofit work serves women and girls, particularly, or has a disproportionate impact because we know that women and girls are often carrying the work of care in the world, and we'll get into that. So thinking both about us as individuals and about us in relationship to the nonprofit sector. We have a little bit of a companion journal. You can open a copy, and I'll share that in the chat later. We probably won't use that today, but it's for you to use later. And there's also the possibility of trying more interaction through Poll EV. So if you are watching this participating on a Zoom screen, on a computer screen, and it's easy, go ahead and open that link if you can see it. I can also put it in the chat. Whoops, sorry. And otherwise, I think there's also a way to text, which I can share in a second. So just to give you a sense of the overall agenda, we are going to talk a little bit about like a tiny mini lecture on contemporary feminist concepts, as well as generating our own thinking about what feminism means. And then a little data share about how COVID has, how our responses to COVID has been gendered. And then a chunk for looking at ideas about what a more feminist future could look like, and then some space for our own debrief and the survey. Does anyone have anything that you want to add? Anything you'd like to see happen in the session today? Something you'd like to put on the agenda? And please feel free to unmute if that's a thing and just speak. It doesn't have to all be in the chat. Going once, going twice. If there is something that you would like to make sure you get out of the session today that doesn't seem like it's covered on the agenda, please feel very welcome to speak up, to connect with Claudette, who is our facilitator, or to put it in the chat. And similarly, interrupt anytime if you have questions that you would like to raise in the presentation. And welcome, thank you. People are continuing to put your introductions in the chat, your name, your pronouns, if you'd like to share them, who you work with, and something that you like. And we'll continue to leave the poll open for another few minutes. You can get a sense of how we're feeling as a group. All right. So let's start by giving this poll thing a try. Sally put the link in the chat, which is very appreciated. So the first question is to share a word that you associate with feminism. So if you go to poll EV and, activity unavailable, let's see. Well, I don't know what just happened. That's too bad. We'll skip it for now and come back to it. You can add in the chat words that come to mind. That's probably easier. Words that come to mind as you think about the word feminism. So, what are some words that just come into your head when you hear the word feminism? And just add them to the chat if the poll EV is not working. Change. Action. All right. How many of you, well, I wish I can't see your faces, which is driving me a little crazy. Hopefully many of you have heard of Mona Eltahawy. She is a very vibrant presence on social media, and her book, 7 Necessary Sins for Women and Girls, I really recommend. So I'm not going to play the video right now, but if you open the slideshow on your own, you can come back and look at some of these links. Eltahawy is Egyptian American and writes about her experience navigating both the misogyny she experienced in Egypt and then globally, as well as in the United States. And she argues that we should think about feminism as a movement to identify, understand, and dismantle misogyny in all forms and in relationship with other systems of oppression. So to really think about feminism, not so much as individual empowerment or how we are in our own identities, although that's absolutely part of it, but to keep our eye on the ball of how systems of oppression are working to disempower or maintain only particular ways of having power for women and girls. Eltahawy's very clear that there's a lot of difference within within the category women and girls, and we'll talk about that a little bit more in a second. Feminism is also understood to be a movement to raise the value of the feminine, to really rethink Are we back?
Thank Kim, you are back.
I'm so sorry, and I don't know what happened.
It's connection.
Let's see. Let me come back to sharing the screen. I'm glad that you see me again. I'm sorry, and I don't actually know where it left off. Did you hear anything about Kate Manne?
Kim.
Okay. All right. So my apologies for that. Let's see. We'll come back to Kate Manne. The essential point is that that Kate Manne wants to make is that blatant sexism. Okay, you last got audio about Mona Eltahawy. Okay, we'll get into Kate Manne just very quickly. She's a philosopher and is making an argument that we should shift from trying to talk about sexism, again, in that kind of individualistic way, that people are not necessarily going to say that they hold old-fashioned sexist ideas about what men and women and non-binary people can or should do. But that instead we've baked into our whole system all of the history of our laws, the way we've organized families, the way we've organized divisions of labor, an assumption of women as what she calls human givers. So she argues that historically, the category we call men get to be human beings, sort of full of humanity, and that women are constructed as human givers, presumed to be bottomless pits of natural nurturing. And because the association is that it is natural, like an inherent part of being a woman, it's not something to be particularly valued or appreciated or thanked for, because when we enact nurturing, those of us who identify as women, we're just doing our thing, our natural thing. And so we shouldn't get especially praised or rewarded for doing what is supposed to be easy. And so when giving, when nurturing, caring, tending, doing what needs to be done is seen as no big deal for one part of the population and probably super hard for the other, it becomes natural to relegate it to the group that's going to find it easy to do. And so Manne makes the argument that because this is so baked into our kind of unconscious assumptions about gender, as well as into all the work, the way that we do our work, that when women refuse to do that kind of giving, if it's refusing to smile to someone, when you're passing them by outside, or if it's refusing to take care of, the housework, or if it's refusing to meet the needs of the organization, that instead of that being sort of seen as healthy, good boundaries, it is seen as denying something inherent about gender, about womanhood. And then the system is set up to punish us because we're withholding something that is owed. So that's a pretty big argument. I am talking about Kate Manne. I see your chat, Claudette. So yes. This is Kate Manne's theory, this idea of the human giver. And so misogyny becomes the violence that gets used to enforce sexism in our lives. And it might be physical violence, or it might be more symbolic violence. But it doesn't have to happen all the time for us to kind of know that the risk that we might get fired if we push back on the assumption of our endless inability to give, the risk that our grant might not come through if we don't give our 120%, or the risk that we might encounter street violence if we don't smile, all those kinds of risks. Because we live with the risk, it doesn't have to always happen to control our behavior. Before I go too much further, I just want to check in and ask how that sounds to you. Does that make any sense to you? Does it resonate, this idea of the human giver as a gendered element, that we expect more giving from women? You can just respond in the chat or unmute. Does that resonate, or does that seem? All right, I got a yes. Thank you, Susie. All right, a few yeses. This idea of the human giver is kind of out in the world getting played with. And one place is the Nagoski sisters, Emily and Amelia, who wrote a fantastic book on burnout. And I've linked, again, you can find all these links if you download the slides. I linked their podcast where they talk about it. So they talk about human giver syndrome. Women must be pretty, happy, yet calm, generous, and attentive to the needs of others. But above all, tied to the demand to be pretty, happy, calm, generous, and attentive. Givers are not allowed to impose anything so inconvenient as their own needs, including their difficult emotions, including their stress, on anyone else. No need for physical affection, no need for rest, no need to complete the stress response cycle. No emotional need for connection or care. No intellectual need to pursue your own sense of purpose or curiosity. And remember, this is our moral duty. If we fall short of our moral duty, we'll get punished. And if no one's around to punish us, we will just go ahead and beat the shit out of ourselves. So just before we move on, I see there's some great responses in the chat. I have a little poll, but I think we're seeing people's that it's resonating about you individually. I'm just going to launch this poll that asks about how this concept might play out in your nonprofit life. So thinking about human giver, if you could just switch over to polls, do you think that not only individuals, but that our organizations are experiencing burnout? Are we suffering from human giver syndrome at the organizational level, presumed to be endlessly able to meet our community needs? Do you think not really? Organizations are giving, but also maintaining some pretty solid boundaries, are there for, are going to sustain? Or do you think, no, we're not really oriented to be responsive to need. There's something else going on. So thinking not just about individuals, but individuals and organizations. All right. And so far the polls overwhelmingly like, yep, there's a lot of human giving going on. And it is tied to the potential of burnout, that it's not just that we're giving to the level that we're good to give, but we're presumed to be able to give more than is really reasonable. And we end up pushing ourselves and each other and responding to that demand. So we're going to come back to this human giver concept in a minute. I just wanted to share a couple of other really important feminist concepts that connect. And the first is one that I think you're probably all familiar with, Kimberlé Crenshaw's concept of intersectionality. If you haven't seen her TED Talk, The Urgency of Intersectionality, I really recommend it. It's fantastic. and explains, I think, something that's a little bit different than sometimes how intersectionality gets used in like regular conversation. And that is that it's not, Crenhaw didn't intend the theory to be describing individuals. And sometimes in sociology, we rely on Patricia Hill Collins came up with this idea of standpoint theory to try to describe how individuals hold multiple identities. And so just thinking about for yourselves, again, and you can feel free to put in the chat. I'm not sure my poll is going to work, my word cloud. Just to think about what are some of the identities you hold that are important to you. So it can be sex, gender identities, sexuality identities, family identities, work-related identities, race, class, religion, nationality. So just to think really broadly, who are you? You're so many things. And which of these social categories of identity are especially important to you? So feel free to, I should have said, have a little journal. Feel free to just make your own notes about yourself, or to share them in the chat. And standpoint theory then kind of connects us to power. So to think about who we are, how we would describe our identities, and then which of those identities are positions of privilege in our society, and which of those identities might be considered targeted identities. So are you in an age group that is more likely to be, well represented in the dominant group or less? Are you part of a religious group that's at the center, or a religious group that is experiencing, marginalization or targeting? So standpoint theory helps us map our own identity in relationship to power in our community. Intersectionality helps us map those oppressions. So Crenhaw was coming from the legal field and thinking about how civil rights laws did, amazing work in helping to remedy oppression, but didn't give people the opportunity to name their experience of oppression at the intersection. So, for example, if somebody is experiencing harassment at work, it's often racial harassment and sexual harassment. It's happening together. But to file a claim, a person has to choose one or the other category. There is no way to file racial and sexual harassment at once. It's both separate. Or if we were to, be trying to, when we were trying to acknowledge hate crimes and the shooting in Atlanta, the language to describe that intersection of gender and class and Asian heritage, that it wasn't, we couldn't pick apart what was the oppression that fueled that shooting. It was the intersection of oppressions. And so Crenhaw is developing this lens to help us understand how bias and discrimination are not just additive, like separate lanes, but more than one thing happening, but what she calls mutually constituting. They change each other. Sometimes I think of it as like a gel lens. So, the yellow and the blue make green. It's not just yellow and blue. It's mutually constituting, become something different. Does anyone have thoughts, questions, additional things you'd like to say about these concepts? I can't see any of your faces, so I'm finding that awkward compared to Zoom. So please use the chat or unmute if there's anything you'd like to say. All right. Well, I definitely recommend watching Crenshaw's talk, where she really explains this explains this well. There's some new words coming into the lexicon to help us again give more language to these intersectional spaces, because words help us describe something that then we can respond to more clearly. So Moya Bailey is a cultural sociologist from Northeastern University and does a lot of work on visual and digital culture. And she coined the concept misogynoir to help really name that intersection of anti-Black racist misogyny. So not just the human giver syndrome, but adding in what are presumptions about what Black women are going to be like in the economy, in the giving economy, as bottomless pits of givers. And we heard some of that from Latasha Brown yesterday. What is the presumption that there is never too much to ask? Where does that come from? And how do we begin to push back on that? What is the process by which people are able to name, this idea that Black women are going to save us is actually racist misogyny, is actually misogynoir. And then what would feminism look like in response? I see a question in the chat about how participants can speak, that there's not just an unmute. Claudette or Sarah, I'm curious if you know how participants can speak.
The chat.
Oh, okay. Well, that's too bad. So we'll try for lots of chatting. And then Jennifer asked, with the idea of intersectionality, are policies shifting? And we will talk about that in a few minutes. And I think that's part of the social movement work that is happening. Crenhaw developed the idea of intersectionality as a legal strategy in the 1990s. So this isn't really new, but there is new energy in trying to shift how we are both in our nonprofit sector landscapes, in philanthropy, and then in the broader political world. So misogynoir describes misogyny that is particular to how Black women negotiate the world. Transmisogyny is a concept. Again, I'm crediting Julia Serano, who wrote the book Whipping Girl, and that's the first place I encountered this concept. I'm not sure that it's her. I'm positive it's not hers alone. All of these ideas are built in intellectual community and activist community, but she has some great language explaining the idea of transmisogyny. And again, trying to just isolate how does oppression work. In particular, the more we disaggregate our concepts, the more we can begin to kind of pick out like, oh, that's what this looks like here. Here's how a response might be most beneficial. So getting more particular in order to generate more powerful responses that then might, go move upward. So Serano argues that trans women face a particular kind of misogyny and are targeted around gender presentation, not just around gender diversity. So that it is in part their femininity and interest in femininity that ends up becoming a real problem for haters and a place where they are particularly discriminated against and encounter violence. She writes, some people have feminine traits or gravitate toward feminine gender expression. Historically, these things have been ridiculed in comparison to masculine interests or gender expression. If people are going to make jokes about transgender people, they usually single out trans women. The underlying theme of the joke is how ridiculous it is that someone who was a man would decide to be a woman, to be feminine. The assumption is that femaleness and femininity are inferior. That's part of the joke. Just as feminists have long argued that women are men's equals, we should also be saying that femininity is masculinity's equal. So again, I just wanted to give a little bit of space for chat discussion. Let's see. Ruta writes, a place misogynoir is extremely and blatantly apparent is with regard to women working in direct caregiving roles. I'm really sorry I can't invite you in to talk more because I would like to hear more about what you're thinking about that. But we will absolutely look at that in just a second, at some of how in COVID, the impact, both the assumption about who's available to do paid care work and who's assumed to do unpaid care work, is gendered and racialized. And we need to pay attention to all those identities. Any other questions, thoughts, comments? I want to give people just a chance to process. All right. Well, just to kind of wrap this piece up, for the rest of this chunk, for this session, we're going to just focus on this idea that one way, not the only way, but one way that misogyny has shown up in this time of COVID and the responses to COVID is this presumption that women are going to play the role of the human giver, and women's workplaces, the nonprofit sector, as well as teaching, nursing, service and retail work, that the places where women are the most likely to work are going to be essential, but not really valued. So this devaluing of the feminine, along with this idea that women are endless, bottomless pits of never running out of energy to take care of other people, and that is not the essential nature of men, has combined to create really, really difficult conditions that lead to burnout, and a kind of burnout that is like really about not doing well, illness, losing work. So, significant consequences. And we have a lot of tools to respond and fight back. As we were talking about, organizations are gendered as individuals are. And this is too much for today, but I'm just thinking a little bit about the transmisogyny piece. I'm a sociologist from a background that separates sex and gender and sees both categories as constructed. So they mean what they mean in a context that we are creating together. And so individuals are gendered, and we make assumptions about what that means together, but often in the background, they're not always named assumptions. But organizations are gendered as well. And just quickly to think about the nonprofit sector, 73% of nonprofit employees identify as women. It's a kind of workplace where we think of it often as a women-dominated space. But in the organizations that have really large budgets, there's very few women leaders. So women are more likely to hold management and direct service positions than they are to be executive directors. And that's increased as an organization gets bigger. And at all levels, there's a persistent gender pay gap in the nonprofit sector. And that pay inequity has all kinds of implications. Again, it comes in part from this idea that these are labors we love. So why would we need to get paid for them? And we have to continue to find language that says, yes, I really care. And I also deserve equitable pay. And because that then makes women cheaper in these cheaper positions, again, less likely to have the higher paid leadership senior positions. On the funding side, only 0.6% of foundation giving came to groups serving women of color in 2016, the last kind of big survey. So when organizations, said who was their primary constituent group, who were they serving the most, just barely 0.5% of that money was targeted to women of color. Overall, only 1.6% of charitable giving came to organizations serving women and girls in general. So we can see there's a huge gap of in the world of money, and that shapes how organizations experience gender. It shapes who works for them, and it shapes the kind of sense of again, human giving at the organizational level. Because if there isn't any money, but the work still has to be done, what happens? And I'd actually love for people to share in the chat, some of your experience of this. What happens if you have really important work, you see the need really clearly, and there's not a lot of money available? What do the organizations you care about do? And I'm going to guess most of us have been doing more with less for many, many years now, have come to expect a little bit that, more with less is the frame that we live by. But we can begin to think about how there's really a lot of misogyny and misogynoir baked into that frame. It doesn't have to be like that. But we have to work, with each other to build more accountability, to have funders rethink some of that funding priority, and have our own organizations do the self inventories to figure out how are we as a workplace, are we actually living our values? Let's see, we talked about that. I again want to just give folks a little bit of a chance to reflect. And again, I'm sorry that we can't have live discussion, but maybe we'll just take a few minutes. So if you have paper or you're on a laptop and you can journal, the questions are: how does misogyny, including misogynoir and transmisogyny, shape your workplace, activism, or other parts of your life? And it can be unwittingly, so not on purpose necessarily. You might not wish that consequence. A lot of how we respond to misogyny are kind of because we don't see another choice. That's part of how misogyny is powerful. We're not actively deciding, we're just responding to the conditions that are kind of the maze we're wandering through. So how does this idea of misogyny shape your workplace, your activism, or another part of your life? The second prompt is: how is the deep acceptance of women as human givers expressed in your community, in your organization? Oh, my cat. And how do we enforce human giver syndrome without directly saying to someone, you must? What are the ways that you see that we request or require more giving of each other without directly saying it? When have you maybe felt like that you were asked to give more than you really had to give, and you didn't, what were the ways that was communicated? So I'm just going to be quiet for 1 minute and give you a chance to reflect, journal, or use the chat. And again, I think another conversation that is not where we're headed, but is to really think about what does it feel like when we do ask for money or other kinds of compensation? What makes that hard? How do we figure out how to articulate a ideology that doesn't commodify work that feels important to us because of the heart, and yet doesn't exploit ourselves or each other? And so I think this is a space, as Melinda wrote, we're often asked to collaborate with other organizations and programs, and we want to, but then we can end up doing work that's beyond what we actually have capacity for. So figuring out new language for this, I think, is going to be really, really important going forward. All right, we're going to switch to talking about some of the facts and figures around responses to COVID. I feel like this is a little bit more talking at you than I was expecting. I didn't realize you wouldn't be able to talk back. So again, please use the chat as much as you can, as much as you'd like. And this, summary in no way captures everything. So please share what you know from your work in the chat as well about where we're experiencing gendered consequences from the responses to COVID-19. So we know that work is one of the most significant places that gender has shaped the responses. Globally, women have lost twice as many jobs than men. And in the US, we're seeing a V-shaped response. So right at the beginning of the lockdowns, women's labor force participation fell dramatically. It fell to the rate of 57.4%, a level not seen since 1988. So essentially, between women being laid off and voluntarily leaving jobs because they, had to take care of their people, there just was this huge shift out of the paid labor force. And that actually was also true for men, but not as at big of a rate. And some of the reason, it was a little bit less than people expected of women is that so many of the essential jobs were not allowing people to take even, like get laid off temporarily. So because women are disproportionately in the service sector, they maintained a lot of their role in lower wage jobs, definitely in the care provider, as was put in the comments, nursing, CNAs. So there was a real tension. One group of women leaving the labor force, and another group being asked to work sometimes double the amount of hours. So stress on both sides of the continuum. As the economy has rebounded and jobs have changed a little bit, jobs that were eliminated have returned more slowly for women of color in particular. And there are now 10% fewer Black women, 9% fewer Hispanic and Latinx women employed now, and 5% fewer white women than pre-pandemic. So this is an example where both race and sex are shaping women's experience in the paid labor force. In the US, millions of women are also considering leaving work for good. And this gets to be a really complicated space trying to capture in real time. But, women are exhausted and still navigating there being no school, no summer camp. And so as we're shifting employment law and, what it takes to claim unemployment, now there had been a break where it was possible to be considered unemployed and getting unemployment insurance, but not actively seeking work, just the pandemic. Now back in Maine, we're returning to people having to be actively looking for work, willing to take low wage work. And so this is going to push some segment of caregivers into being voluntarily out of the workforce. That doesn't mean they actually, in our hearts want to be not without paid work, but not necessarily seeing another choice. So it's going to take some time for the data to catch up to really explain. This graph you obviously can't see at all, but it is linked in the slideshow. And it just, again, breaks down a lot of the differences among women workers. So we want to be careful not to overgeneralize about a category, but to really think about how race, age, education levels, and parenting status shape women's experience of work and unemployment. And again, you can see for single mothers, it's the hardest, and it is, again, very racialized. So 9.5%, this was, I think, in the most recent American Community Survey, of Asian, non-Hispanic single mothers were unemployed. 9.3% of Black non-Hispanic mothers were employed. 8.8% of single mothers who identify as Hispanic were unemployed, and 5% of white non-Hispanic single mothers were unemployed. And the graph you can't see breaks that down even more. Work is not the only place, as we know, and particularly for people working in organizations that are serving community. There's so many more consequences of COVID lockdowns. The World Economic Forum publishes a report every year on the how close we are to gender parity in a bunch of different categories, the global gender gap. And they reassessed. So they had said that we were 99 years from closing the gender gap at the global level. And now we are at 135.6 years before we reach parity between women and men on economic opportunity, political power, education, and health. It's a really interesting report, fairly depressing. The US is actually doing a little better this year than we have in the past, but overall, the gaps are growing. By the end of 2021, the UN predicts that up to 47 million more women and girls will have fallen into extreme poverty, a jump of 9% from 2019. We know domestic violence has increased in all groups, with one commission in the United States estimating an increase of 8% in incidents, but a lot of agreement that we, again, won't really know because we aren't able to reach people in order to measure. And so it will take research, after lockdowns end, to try to understand how significant experiences of interpersonal and domestic violence and sexual violence have been during the lockdowns. And in terms of family divisions of labor, the presumption that we were going to see a big rise in divorce has actually not happened as of yet. But men report being much more satisfied with their relationship than women do. And this last bit, I don't know if you can see on the slide, but 55% of men compared to 38% of women are satisfied with their gender division of labor. The Pew Research Center has done a lot of studies, as are other groups. And there's just a very persistent gap in perception about who's doing what and what it means for well-being. So 59% of women, as compared to 34% of men, say that women do more household chores and have more responsibility in their homes. And for cohabitating families, 74% of mothers say that they do more around managing their children's schedules and activities. whereas 55% of fathers say that they do more. So there's a lot of tension in this space, and we can reconnect that to some of our human giver analysis. Why would fathers underestimate how much mothers do? Why would women be more likely to say that they do more than men do? And what does that end up meaning for the actual how time is spent? We have time studies that actually do affirm that women, and in particular mothers, are doing more when they keep time diaries. And so this is causing a lot of conflict in families. We also know that for parents who are able to telework, that mothers just did a lot more parenting. And in part, this is because, single women are more likely to be single mothers than men are likely to be single fathers. So they have primary custodial relationships, but also in families where there are cohabitating adults, women are taking responsibility for remote school on one phone while they're working on the other at a far greater rate. Again, we kind of have to keep making these connections. In part, this is because the wage gap means that families are more worried about losing men's jobs, which tend to be higher paying. And in part, it's because a lot of the invisible labor is invisible. I could go on, but I want to make sure we talk about some of the responses. But I just want to check the chat. The numbers are alarming. It's sobering and disheartening. Heartbreaking and telling. Yeah. Yes. I think that this is these facts and figures reflect a lot of story, and we need more time and space to share the stories and really understand the impact. It can be almost numbing to hear like, oh, 80 cents on the dollar. Yep, whatever. And actually, it is very significant for the snowball of how we maintain misogyny and then how we unroll it and challenge it. So I think it is important that we acknowledge it's sobering and disheartening. We are not making progress, but we can, and in some places we are. So we'll shift to that. What are some of the things that are going to happen, that are potentially going to happen, that we're going to help make happen coming forward? I'm going to share a little bit more in a second, but we are seeing women leaders around the world acknowledging that women's labor, the unpaid labor in families, the labor, of, if any of you have older parents, I mean, the amount of time I spent finding them a vaccine appointment and taking my 80-year-old parents, keeping them from being out in the world, that's not time that is ever getting recorded for the formal economy, but was essential to keeping more people out of the hospital. We know that was primarily sandwich generation, daughters taking care of older people, taking care of younger people, and taking care of community. So Mercedes D'Alessandro from Argentina says, after a year that has underscored how essential women's labor is to the economy, from unpaid care work to frontline healthcare roles, governments owe it to women. Without all the work that women did this year, there'd be no economy to rebuild. And we're seeing with the American Recovery Act, this is, the first investment that includes an investment for parenting in a generation. So families will start to see the child's tax credit show up in bank accounts. It is going to be $3,000 a year for each child under 18 and $3,600 for children under 6. And instead of going into it used to be you had to do your taxes and it got taken off your taxes. Now it will be actually delivered monthly, including to families without an income. And experts are saying that will cut the child poverty rate by 40%. So just an example, there's a lot more in the American Recovery Act, but one example of how something can change. Oh, sorry, this slide's out of order. So coming back to the Nagoski sisters, they had some advice for how to how to respond to human giver syndrome. And I am curious to invite you to think about this for yourself and to think about it for your organizations, and for us to think together about it for our policy and the sector. So they have 3 survival skills they shared. The first is giving should be shared. Noticing the difference between how it feels to give with a fellow giver versus how it feels in your body to give with someone who, the more you give to them, the more entitled they feel to take from you. So just for a second, let's sit with that one. How do we change our individual relationships to giving and our organizational relationships to giving so that there's a sense of reciprocity? We give what we have to give, and we are given to when we need it. We're able to map what our community needs, and everyone shares in the giving to meet those needs. So just take a second and play with that one in your mind or on the chat. What's the possibility of going from a model that says our community's experiencing, increased hunger, you care, so you figure out how to make sure everybody gets food, to we all care about this, we are all going to give something to solving this problem. How might we begin to feel differently, less burned out? Their second survival strategy is boundaries are healthy. We have to disentangle human giver syndrome from our decision-making process about where we put our energy. Challenge the voice in our head that says, you owe it to the world to give everything you have. We will not rest until X or Y or Z, because if we rest, that's good for us. And X, Y, or Z needs us to empty ourselves until we have nothing left. Disentangle that sense of obligation to instead ask, where is my energy going? Where is it best and most efficiently spent? Again, just take a second. Jennifer shares, I've started to really say no and to honor my no's and celebrate them. And Lisa shared it. If we were to have more collective giving, if all of us were in it to give, we might feel more respected, appreciated, and less resentful. If we hold stronger boundaries, can we invite more people and organizations that are more coded as men's work, masculine, full of men, individually men, to be givers as well? And their third point for human giver syndrome is to celebrate others' boundaries, to really celebrate others' rest and joy. That if we respond to our friends with can't you do more? Shouldn't you do more? Why aren't you doing more? Even in our kind of implication. So not, probably none of us would actually speak to someone that way, but how might we make the people we work with feel like they should be doing more? And what would it look like if we truly celebrated rest and joy? And again, I think some of this came up in the keynote yesterday. What does it look like to, in particular, find ways to support Black joy and the rest and joy of people who are experiencing multiple marginalization and oppression, and to think about what are the resources needed that make rest and joy genuinely possible. So it isn't enough to say, oh, your work's not important, no one needs that done, because it's not true. We have to collectively see the need, ensure that needs are being met by all kinds of givers. Let people set individual boundaries and organizational boundaries that help them thrive, that have their energy used best, and then genuinely invest resource that lets people have rest and joy and have it not be at the expense of other people genuinely suffering. This alone would be like a great project for an organization, just to think about what are the kinds of changes that would need to happen so that rest and joy were central to the mission, and not left to, not to have a culture where taking vacation days is kind of, sneaky, but instead is essential to the work. But we also want to think about challenging some of the power structure and some of the policy. So coming back to Eltahawy from the beginning, her book, 7 Necessary Sins, lists these 7 qualities that she would like to see feminists take up: anger, attention, profanity, ambition, power, violence, and lust. She sees the human giver as a piece of what happens with the patriarchy, but she argues that we also are required to play small in almost every way in order to stay safe from male violence. And she is done with it, and really wants to encourage others to just take up so much more space to claim these qualities that have not been associated with women, and make them ours. And in particular for this conversation, I think attention and ambition are, especially important to think about how we could encourage ourselves and each other to be more angry at the conditions that we and others are living in that aren't necessary, and to demand attention for those issues that we care about. So rather than sort of seeing the need and filling the need through giving, what if we had other tools to force the attention, and bring ambition and power to the solutions? She writes, ambition is defiance. It is the middle finger up to patriarchy's insistence that we shrink ourselves. Attention and ambition are cousins. The former defies patriarchy through the belief that I deserve attention, and the latter by declaring I am more than. A similar arrogance fuels both attention and ambition. I am a big fan of female arrogance. The who do you think you are that punishes the sin of attention also pushes back against the sin of ambition. And for daring to want attention and for being ambitious, we are shrunk and diminished by that lasso. Who do you think you are? Those words are the equivalent of being forced to stand in front of a funhouse mirror that reflects us back at half our natural sizes. One way to think about expressing our rejection of human giver syndrome is to reconsider what we're really ambitious about. And so I just want to invite you again, last invitation for the chat, to share some of your ambitions, personally, organizationally. Eltahawy says, my ambition is to be free. And if you read the book, you'll see it really is. Nawal El-Sadawi says, my ambition is to be savage and dangerous. My ambition is to make revolution irresistible. Tony Cade Bambara. My ambition is to be a menace to my enemies. June Jordan. What is your ambition? What is your organizational ambition? What's your bold, not human giver ambition? And just to think about, what's in your way? What might make your ambition a little bit dangerous? Why is it an ambition to be free? Melinda asked, how do we encourage men to be givers when that quality is associated with women? And that is absolutely the powerful kind of circle that sexism and misogyny play. If the feminine and female are devalued, then that which is associated with them is devalued, and that maintains male power. We know, for example, when women, enter a work sector, the wages in that sector go down. The devaluing of the feminine is institutional. It's not just interpersonal. And so what are some of the strategies that help expand the valuing of the feminine? I think the organization Maine Boys to Men is a good example of a feminist organization working to do that. And if you're interested, you might watch the film "The Mask You Live In." I'll put it in the chat, because we know that there is a big price to pay for staying in the very narrow box of masculinity that gets constructed for boys and men. And so things like dying younger than girls and women, being at more risk of violence, of experiencing violence towards themselves, towards each other, of not having a big emotional range, being disconnected and lonely. The author Niobe Way writes beautifully about the mental and physical health toll that comes from disconnection for boys and men. They say, as young people, having a friend is what saves them, keeps them from going crazy. And then in their late teens and early 20s report that friends is a feminine thing. Like, I'm not going to have friends. That's girly. And they literally do experience going crazy. And so there's a lot of reason to embrace being a giver for the rewards it brings. Boys and men also want better connections to the people they love. They report in survey data, they want to be equal caregivers. And then that structure makes it really hard. And so there's a lot we can do to show the good side of being a giver and the pain and suffering that comes from being a burned out giver. In that holding of the boundary, it's possible to sort of meet in the middle. It's good for everybody. We only have 3 minutes left, so I just want to close by saying that there is a policy place for feminism as well. So we can do this sort of individual and cultural work inside our organizations. If we reject human giver syndrome and start to name our bigger, bolder ambitions, we can lead the way. And then we can work together to really have ambitions for our whole society. There are 2 big reports, one out of Hawaii and one out of Canada, that have made big suggestions about what a feminist response would look like. And in this link, you can read the summary, or you can link to the individual reports. Together, they suggest that we use an intersectional analysis and disaggregated data. We don't want to make big claims about what's happening for a population. We want to understand who has been most affected, who's most vulnerable, and have responses to those groups, led by those groups. We want equitable participation and leadership. We want to support the social infrastructure and the care economy. We never wanted to say that doesn't matter again. We want good jobs for displaced and marginalized workers. When we look at who has been forced out of the labor market and who is working despite really poor working conditions, this is an opportunity to make change. We want a sustainable and green recovery. We know that our interests are very tied to climate justice. We want accessible, affordable, and quality healthcare for all. The disproportionate rates of infection and hospitalization, death, chronic illness are going to be with us for a long time. We know that in particular, Black and brown people in the United States have been very disproportionately affected by COVID infection. How do we do better in responding to that? And we want to address gender-based violence and all kinds of hate crimes. So this is their policy response and call to action, and you can look at it for ways to connect. And finally, I've added a few links just to get started on how to bring some of these resources to your own work. So there's a great organization called Decent Work for Women, and they have a lot of tools for organizational inventories. There's the Gender Working Group that is looking at policy specifically around COVID-19. Insight, Beyond the Nonprofit Industrial Complex, has been working on funding for a long time. And the Marshall Plan for Moms is an example of policy specifically addressing the disproportionate effects on mothers. We are at 10:15. Thank you so much for coming. Again, you can get the links and feel free to follow up with me if I can be of help with anything particular. And I look forward to meeting you in networking. And I'm sorry we couldn't talk. I will hang out for another minute if people have comments in the chat. And Claudette has posted the link to the survey that everyone's asked to do at the end. Claudette or Sarah, is there anything else that is meant to be said about what happens next?
No, you are good, Kim. Thank you so much for your presentation.
Thank you. Thank you for helping me, Claudette, and thank you for being here, everybody, and yay for a feminist future. And I think there's
a way to go, and it's so inspiring. Thank you.
Thank you. I don't have the schedule of what's next, but I know there's amazing things happening later today too.
Yeah, many things.
Oh, Amber, thank you. I will do that right now.
Okay.
All right, Claudette, are we good to go?